Dear poor people, guess who's at it again? Joy Reid.
Ecosystem, and it is the enablers in the ecosystem, right? And we'll see and be monitoring and be sharing with people what people are saying. But just we polled earlier today, even before this, what some people have been saying in the last couple of days. I mean, Tim Scott, who obviously wants to be the vice president, he posted a full-minute video saying that Alvin Bragg is the only one who's guilty, called the trial sham and a witch hunt. The only verdict that matters is the one at the ballot box. Okay, but you know, Rubio literally compared the trial to Cuban show trials. Kristi Noem called it a rigged trial. Ted Cruz says this is a kangaroo court. Byron Donalds, this is election interference. These enablers are what enable Trump to create his ecosystem. And they are incentivized to do that because either they want to be the vice president, they want to be in his good order, and because he is the leader of the Republican Party. This is the Republican Party.
Yeah, I just have, I'm sorry, you said you've triggered me thoroughly.
Oh, I didn't mean to trigger. I'm just reading quotes.
Because Byron Donalds, who is from East Flatbush, Brooklyn, as myself, and Tim Scott, who is from the great state of South Carolina, and Marco Rubio, who is Latino, they know damn well who normally ends up at the bottom of this criminal justice system.
Who are the actual victims of a two-tiered system of justice, which he has co-opted that term.
They know exactly that what they're saying is not just factually incorrect, that in the state where Byron Donalds is a congressman, his governor, Ron DeSantis, has dog-walked black voters for voting and had made a show of it to make sure they're on television, to humiliate them out of voting, to frighten them out of voting. His state is the one that passed overwhelmingly a constitutional amendment to restore the voting rights of people because they had that post-enslavement Jim Crow law automatically taking the rights of felons to vote from them, which is a Jim Crow relic. That state had it. It repealed it. And then Governor DeSantis and his Republicans interfered with it to make it harder for people who had served their time to vote. They understand fully because they have lived in the bodies of black men, those two black men, and they're willing to sell themselves cheap. Not even Clarence Thomas will do that. At least he requires it to be expensive. For them, it can be absolutely dirt cheap, free. That's the cheapest it could be, to sell your soul and the lives and memory of all of the black men and women and brown men and women who have suffered in a criminal justice system where they can't delay it, where the Supreme Court won't help them, where they won't have Samuel Alito fly an upside-down flag for them, where they won't have any of the benefits that Donald Trump has used to kill every case but this one, including humiliating Fani Willis in Georgia to try to shame her out of prosecuting him. The one good thing that happened here is that this case was brought in a state that no Republican controls. Because if it did, the same thing that happened in Georgia would have happened here. Thank God for the state of New York, Donald Trump's home state, because there was no way for him to interfere with the process of justice. And in this rare instance, as somebody who's quite critical many times of the criminal justice system, the system actually worked the way it is supposed to work. And I agree with you. The one thing that would ruin this very rare moment when we can all say the criminal justice system can actually see past your power and see past your race and your wealth, the only thing that would ruin it is if anyone finds out who these jurors are, because God help them if that happens, because then Donald Trump will do what he does.
Their safety.
Well, I have a question. Did Joy Reid just say the quiet part out loud? She said that this case was able to go through and they were able to get the verdict that they got because they were in a state where there is no Republican control. And so therefore Donald Trump couldn't interfere. Well, wait a second. First of all, let me start by saying this. I am somebody who 100% believes in law and order. I have said that. I continue to say that. And even today, after this verdict, I still say I believe in law and order. I also believe that you have to accept decisions that you don't like. Every jury doesn't return a decision that you like. Every case is not handled in the way that you like it, and you still have to accept that, because when you do not do that, there are very, very dangerous consequences when you're unwilling to accept the verdict of a jury. However, with that said, if this is true justice, what that would mean is that it doesn't have to take place in a particular place. Justice can't be different in New York than it is in South Carolina, than it is in Oklahoma, than it is in Florida. If you had the same basic tenets of the case, you should be able to take that to any jury and find 12 reasonable people who could look at what you say is evidence and come to the same conclusion. It should not be that only people in New York see it this way, but not anywhere else. That, in fact, is actually making the case that maybe there is something suspicious to this. Because if I really have evidence, if I've actually done something, and a prosecutor has been able to collect enough evidence that he or she believes that they could go to 12 reasonable people, they should be able to go to 12 reasonable people anywhere and say, hey, here's this evidence and here's this law. Now, you decide if this is a violation of the law. This shouldn't be only New Yorkers could see it this way. That's very suspicious. And I'm thinking maybe Joy Reid is telling on herself and telling on New Yorkers and possibly telling on Democrats if this is something that no other reasonable people could possibly see. That's very suspicious. You are not helping yourself here, Miss Reid. You are not doing yourself a favor. In fact, you are actually creating more suspicion than otherwise would have existed. Well, listen, I want to agree with Joy Reid for sure. I do think that the privacy of the jurors should be protected. I do not believe in doxing jurors and all of this type of stuff, because what it does is it opens them up to absolutely unfair intimidation and God forbid, but possibly even harm or violence. And people who are doing their civic duty, who are called to participate in that process and who do that, should not then have to suffer after the fact, whether or not I agree, you agree, or anybody agrees with the decision that they came to. They should not have to suffer, unless, of course, the jury was doing something outside of what their instructions were. So if they were told not to talk about the case and they were found talking about the case, or if they were told, if they have not violated what their instructions were, then their privacy should be held. And I absolutely agree with that. However, I want to go back to Miss Reid. Okay, first of all, Miss Reid and co. The group here seems to really be missing a point. And I personally take exception at the idea that Tim Scott and Byron Donalds and Marco Rubio can't disagree with a verdict by virtue of their ethnicity and their skin color. That is backwards. Miss Reid, you are absolutely backwards if that's the tack you are coming from, and that's certainly what you said. People have a right to have their own feelings, to have their own opinion, and to say, well, somebody said that this was like a Cuban show trial. Well, let me tell you something. I've not been to Cuba. I've not been to court in Cuba. I don't know what Cuban show trials were like. Maybe instead of disparaging Marco Rubio, somebody should have asked him, how is it different? How is it different? How was this trial different than a Cuban show trial? Maybe we would know then. Stop automatically flying off the handle when people say something, going, well, that's wrong, with no information. Ask these people a question and say, okay, if you think this is like a Cuban show trial, what are the features of Cuban show trials? Maybe the American people could benefit to see, is this like one? Do we have the same features as that? And if so, maybe that's something we'd like to look at. But to simply say because Byron Donalds and Tim Scott walk around as Black men and in black skin, that they are somehow selling their soul and betraying their Blackness or some level of betrayal because they see this differently than how you see it and how the company over there at MSNBC sees it, is completely ridiculous and it's unfair. And I will tell you this, you should be very careful about charging people with things like selling their soul for a particular ideology and an opinion and selling it cheap. Because you know what, Miss Reed, that in fact may be something people could say to you. So I would be very, very careful about that. If you want people to believe that your opinion is delivered to them in earnest, you have to accept that in other people. And when you cannot accept that in other people, when you think other people have ulterior motives, what it does is it points the finger at you and makes the rest of us look at you and go, wonder what your motives might be. So you might want to be careful with that. Please remember to like, share, subscribe. Thank you so much for visiting my channel. I hope to see you again. Please look for me the next time I drop a video. Can't wait to see you again. Have a great day. Bye-bye.